In each moment, what we call conscious experience isn't one single thing. It's a stack, multiple layers of awareness happening at the same time. Even though it feels like one solid experience, the brain integrates it so fast that it comes across like one unified thing, but it's not. It's layers. And in this series, I'm breaking down that stack into 3 planes. So we have the biological plane, which is the body and its ancient intelligence. We have the psychological plane, which is emotion, attention, memory, and the ego. And then the symbolic plane, which is the deep language of meaning. It's myths, it's archetypes, it's ideals. It's the things that shape your interpretation of reality before you even notice that you're interpreting things. So, last time, we built the biological plane from the ground up, and we started at the molecular level, which is chemistry. Then we moved to the cellular level, living systems, and then we saw how all of this builds into tissues and organs, which made us arrive at instinctive awareness, which are those deep animal programs that run inside of you. It's seeking, it's fear, it's rage, it's care, panic, play. That's the animal engine. And we ended right there, right at the top of biology. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to keep climbing, and we're going to look at how instinct becomes feeling, and then where feeling shapes perception, and where perception becomes a story about you. So this is the psychological plane. And just like biology was broken down into 3 layers, molecular, cellular, and instinctive, we're going to break psychology down into layers. So here's the 3 layers of the psychological plane. We have affective awareness, we have perceptual awareness, and we have narrative awareness. And if off the bat all that sounds kind of abstract, don't worry, because by the end of the video, you're going to be able to understand each level better. So let's start at layer 1, which is affective awareness. And let's hold on a second. I want to slow down here because affect is one of those words that psychologists use that sounds kind of complicated, but it's really not complicated. Affect is basically the raw feeling tone of the moment. It's the emotional weather inside of you. So here's an example to show you what I mean. The other night, I'm in bed. It's super late. I'm half asleep. The room is completely dark. And I've got these Bluetooth lights in my room, the kind that you connect to your phone so you can change the color and everything. And out of nowhere, just as I'm drifting off to sleep, this little spotlight above my doors just turns on by itself. So before I have any rational thought at all, right in that moment, the tone of the room changes, and it feels more dangerous than it did a second ago. That shift in atmosphere or feeling tone is what psychologists call affect. Now, I'm not talking about the fact that I was suddenly alert. I'm talking about the emotional lean of the moment. Does it feel safe or unsafe? Does it feel good or bad? Does it feel high energy or low energy? I sort of like using the analogy of a soundtrack here. And so maybe one of the most classic examples of a soundtrack is the soundtrack in the movie Jaws. In Jaws, it's a bunch of people having a bunch of fun on the beach, but the second that you hear that music, suddenly the emotional tone changes. And it's not just people having fun at the beach anymore. It's a dangerous situation that's about to unfold. So notice how the soundtrack can change everything. If the soundtrack is fun and uplifting and energetic, a beach scene looks like a great time. But if that soundtrack is dangerous and dissonant, the exact same clip of film becomes a completely different movie. So we don't just react to what we see. I mean, the very word react means reciprocal reaction. So you're never seeing the raw data without bringing this internal state to the table with it. So to be aware of that soundtrack that's playing in the background in each moment of your life is what I'm calling affective awareness. We don't just react to what we see. We bring our individual preconceived notions with us, and what you perceive in the world changes because of it. And that leads us to layer 2 of the psychological plane, which is perceptual awareness. And I'll start by saying this. There's a common mislabeling that we make whenever we try to simplify the brain. We compare it to a computer or to a machine or even like a camera, like it just records the world and plays it back. But your brain's more like a living human being than a machine. It's like a person or a detective that's constantly making a best guess theory about what's going to happen and then checking the evidence. So most of what you see is your brain's best guess updated in real time. It's often based on that soundtrack that's playing in the background. So if the feeling tone is worry, it looks for evidence or reasons to worry. If the feeling tone is relaxation, show me reasons to relax. If the feeling tone is failure, show me evidence that I'm failing. So let's go back to my example the other night with the light turning on. The second that it turns on, my mind doesn't just calmly take in the room like a camera. My attention starts editing the room because the switch for the light is outside of my room. So is this a glitch with the app on my phone, or did someone switch the light on from the outside? So my attention goes to the crack under the door. Are there shadows? Is there movement? And suddenly the rest of the room barely exists. My eyes could technically see everything, but my mind is sampling a narrow slice of reality, looking for whatever answers the question, does this matter? Is this dangerous? What should I do? Then immediately my attention shifts to my nightstand where I keep my .45, ready for a home invasion. Then I look at my dog and see if I notice that he's doing anything, pointing at the door or something. Notice what's happening here. I'm building a kind of internal storyboard, and I'm ranking the order of importance in a kind of hierarchy. And what I perceive in the world is filtered by what feels most important in that moment. So neuroscientists sometimes call that system that does that, the one that takes what matters and yanks the spotlight of attention to it. They call it the salience network. So salience just means what's important right now. Sort of like an internal bouncer that shines his flashlight and says, hey, you, front of the line. What's interesting is your brain seems to be biased towards potential danger more than potential good, because missing a threat is more costly than missing a pleasant surprise. Think of it from an evolutionary survival lens. If you're more likely to mistake a random sound in the bushes for a tiger, and if you steer clear of anything like that, you're going to be more likely to survive than someone who isn't scared of a random sound that actually happens to be a tiger. So this is probably why, if we're honest, we probably all get a little bit spooked whenever you're going up the stairs in the basement when it's dark. So negative signals tend to get tagged as more important faster. And researchers have a way to test something like this. So here's what they do. They'll get someone and they'll sit them in front of a screen and tell them to keep their eyes on the center of the screen. And so that's where their attention starts. Then for a split second, they flash two images left and right on the screen. One is a neutral face and one is a face that looks threatening, like an angry expression. Then the images disappear, and then immediately a tiny dot pops up on one side of the screen. So because of our tendency to label negative signals as more important, what the researchers find is whenever that tiny dot appears on the same side that the threatening face was on, subjects seem to react faster. So that's the salience network. The brain is tagging possible danger as high priority whenever the negative face is there. And so whenever the dot pops up, they're already sort of focusing on that. So what's actually more interesting about that even is that whenever they do these studies and people who show up to those studies report higher anxiety, they show a stronger pull towards the threatening face. So their spotlight shifts there faster. And sometimes that means that they react faster to the dot on the side of the screen. And that kind of ties back to that first layer we talked about, which is affective awareness. Because those people with anxiety that show up, that their emotional tone, the soundtrack that's playing, that has anxiety, it sets the mood for what they perceive. And we notice negative signals more than positive ones. And so that same process is exactly what unfolded in my bedroom light example. So the most logical assumption is that something went wrong with Bluetooth or on the app. Not that someone sneaked into my house and switched my bedroom light on, but because the emotional tone of the room feels unsafe, my attention snaps to the most relevant cues. The door, the crack underneath it, the shadows, my nightstand, my dog. Because in that moment, my brain is like a detective trying to collect all this evidence and build a storyboard that turns into a living narrative. So you see how that's sort of starting to come together? So perceptual awareness is your ability to catch that filtering process while it's happening. It's the moment that you realize, I'm collecting evidence for a story that I'm building in real time. And not only that, but the soundtrack that I started with, affect, set the stage for what I'm perceiving. So this is sort of turning into a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that is how we get to layer 3, which is narrative awareness. But first, let's just notice what we did there really quick. In order to organize that whole thought process in a way that made any sense at all, we had to put it into sequential order. So we had to make it into some kind of story. We had to say, first, the light turned on. Then I felt a sense of unease. And then that caused me to look at the door because I thought someone was in the house. So narrative is sort of baked into how we organize our experience. But narrative isn't just a timeline, though. It's also an identity, because whenever your brain turns these moments into a story, it automatically answers, well, who is this happening to? And the answer is me. So narrative is the thread that ties one moment and the next and says, this is still the same person moving through it. So I was the one that was in the room when the light turned on, and I'm the one who felt the fear, and I'm the one that's deciding what to do next. That's what turns these scattered moments into my experience instead of just random snapshots. And this is where you're faced with the fact that the stories that you tell yourself can be a cage that you're stuck in or a construct that you can choose to step out of. Once the story forms, it starts steering the whole system. And the longer that you keep the stories alive, the more your entire identity and reality update with it. So in my bedroom light example, I ended up pretty quickly realizing what actually happened. The smart light just needed an update and it glitched. But notice what my brain did first. For a split second, it didn't start with the most likely explanation. It started with the most dangerous one. It ran a real quick mental highlight, like someone's outside, someone broke in, you're not safe. And that's because the brain is built for survival. So if there's danger and you ignore it, the cost is huge. So your brain would rather give you a few false alarms than miss a real threat. But here's the important part. I was able to sort of settle down quickly because my bigger life experience or my default story about the world says I live in a pretty safe environment. Break-ins aren't common. Most weird stuff has a normal explanation. So once I gathered a little more information, my mind just updated and the story changed. But imagine someone else. Imagine you grew up in a place where break-ins were common, or you'd been robbed recently, or you had to stay on guard your whole life. If that was your history, your brain's doing what it learned it needed to do. In that case, when the light turns on, the story locks in harder. Someone's in my house. And you don't just calm down quickly because the story matches what your life has taught you to expect. So the point is that the way that you interpret each moment is shaped by the bigger story that you're carrying about your life. And once a story forms, it doesn't just explain what happened. It starts steering the whole system because your mind doesn't look for facts only. It looks for facts that fit the preconceived story. So if your story is, I'm failing, your attention starts scanning your world for proof. You might notice the slightly annoyed tone in people's voice, or the one mistake you made, or the one message that was left on read, or the fact that someone else seems ahead of you in some area in life. And even if 10 things go right, your spotlight keeps snapping to that one thing because it confirms the story. See, I'm failing. Or if your story is people can't be trusted, your mind starts looking for evidence like a detective with one suspect. You start to notice a delay in their reply, the weird facial expression, the one time they didn't follow through, the one detail that feels off for some reason. And maybe there are innocent explanations, but your brain isn't searching for those innocent explanations. It's building a case that confirms the kind of person that you think you are and the kind of world that you think that you live in. But when you really start paying attention to what's really going on, you can start to see the illusion fall away. We've all had an experience where a friend or a family member or someone we know is clearly stuck in some kind of story, and they just can't seem to see the obvious facts right in front of them. And from the outside, it's almost painful. You're sitting there thinking like, it's right there. It's so obvious. How can't you see this? But then we've also had the opposite experience before, or at least I have, where someone hits you with a tough love sort of fact or truth. And it's not to be mean. They just actually see your situation without your bias. And they're pointing out something that you genuinely didn't notice about yourself. And whenever that happens, well, what happens at first? You want to defend it. You want to explain it away. Because ultimately what that's doing is threatening your identity. So narrative isn't something that you have. It's something that you are. So when someone pulls at that thread, it feels like they're pulling you apart. But then, in those sorts of situations, sometimes you sit with it, what they said, and then it clicks. And it's like the blinders come off. And suddenly you realize, oh, I really do that. I didn't even know I was doing that. That moment right there is whenever you become aware of the narrative. And that's what I mean by narrative awareness. So narrative awareness is the ability to step outside of your own story and see it in the same way that you see someone else's. It's being able to sort of hold your life like a book in your hands and to look at yourself in the third person, not with judgment or shame, but with curiosity. It's like, well, wait, what is he doing in this moment right now? What role is he playing right now? What's he assuming that is true? What's he leaving out? And if someone else is reading this book and this part, what would they say is happening? What would they say is happening? So the goal here isn't to delete your narrative. You can't. Humans run on narrative. The goal is to be no longer hypnotized by it. It's to be able to say, this is a story that my mind is generating to make sense of things, and it might be useful, but ultimately my brain isn't designed to find ultimate truth. It's designed for survival. So let's try to wrap this up real quick. So I've explained that this psychological plane sort of like a ladder. Like first there's affect, then there's perception, then there's narrative, because that's probably the easiest way to teach it. We have to go sort of step by step. But in your actual life, you don't really experience each moment like that necessarily. It's all sort of happening at the same time in a kind of loop. So the soundtrack is running underneath everything, and that's the sort of feeling tone. And that soundtrack quietly aims the spotlight of your attention. It makes you notice certain things. It makes you ignore others. And whatever that spotlight grabs gets sort of stitched into a story. It's like, what's happening? What does that mean? And who am I inside of that story? And once that story forms, it doesn't just sit there. It sort of feeds back down into the system. So if the story becomes people can't be trusted, the spotlight starts collecting all the suspicious details, and that soundtrack sort of stays tense. So it's not three layers that are separate from each other that you switch in between. It's one living system that's constantly updating in real time. So affect sets the mood, perception selects the evidence, and then narrative explains what it all means. And then that meaning reaches back down and changes how you feel and what you notice next. And that's the whole point of awareness here. Is once you start to notice this loop, you can break the illusion. So anyways, I think that's probably all for today. That's the psychological plane. But real quick, let's zoom out and look all the way out. So look at this whole map that we've created in these last two videos. And notice what this actually is. It's not this ladder of separate parts where we have biology over here and psychology or you over there. It's one living pattern that's repeating itself over and over at different levels of resolution. So if you remember in the last video, at the very bottom of the biological plane, there's molecular awareness, and that's the raw intelligence of fit. It's chemistry recognizing chemistry. It's attraction and repulsion. It's the earliest form of orientation. This fits, that doesn't. When that same tilt shows up in the psychological plane, it becomes affect. So the emotional lean of the moment. Attraction or repulsion becomes good or bad. It's the same basic pattern that you see at that molecular level, but it's more aware of itself. It's more broad and more realized. So now if we move one level up on the biological side, above the molecules, we get cells. And now it's not just basic fit anymore. Cells have a kind of selfhood. So they draw a line in the universe. This is me. This is not me. This comes in. This stays out. This is nourishment. That's a threat. Now at a higher resolution, that biological cellular boundary becomes psychological perception. Because perception isn't just seeing, perception is the mind drawing a membrane around reality and saying, this is part of my world right now. That gets excluded. This matters. That doesn't. So just like cells coordinate through signaling, your perception coordinates through your attention. So your attention is basically the nervous system version of cellular signaling. It recruits resources, it organizes the system, it tells the rest of you what to orient around. So the cell draws a boundary in biology, and the self draws a boundary in psychology. The cell filters matter, and the self filters meaning. Now, if we move up one more level on the biological side, this is where everything gets wired together through the nervous system. Because once you have a nervous system, you don't just have signals, you have these integrated programs, these whole body modes that move you before you even think about them. That's the Panksepian instincts: seeking, fear, rage, care, play, panic, all 7 of them. And the simplest way to understand these is that an instinct is a loop. A cue shows up, the program fires, the body acts, and then the loop completes. So like a male bird might see another male bird with a red breast, and it just attacks. It's stimulus, and it's program, and then it's action, and then it's done. That's an instinct. It's a loop that moves the body. Now watch what happens when the same pattern shows up on the psychological plane. Narrative is also a loop, but it's made of meaning. So something happens, your mind assigns an interpretation, puts you in a role, and starts steering what you do next. And so here's the difference. Human loops don't always complete in the physical world. We can rerun them in our heads. We can replay an argument. We can rehearse rejection. We can relive embarrassment. We can predict a betrayal. So instead of red belly, attack, done, like in the bird example, we have loops like, this means I'm not safe. This means I'm failing. This means people can't be trusted. Because the loop is abstract, it keeps feeding on itself. So that story makes the soundtrack more tense. The soundtrack aims the spotlight, and the spotlight finds the evidence, and the evidence reinforces the story. So you could say that instinct is a loop that orients the body, and narrative is a loop that orients the soul. Okay, I think that's all for today. In the next video, we're going to take that same structure that we're working with here and take it one level higher to the symbolic plane. And the symbolic plane is where your narratives stop just being my story and start plugging into something deeper, like patterns of meaning that are beyond us, the archetypal themes, the deep structure themes that you see across all cultures and philosophy and all of the stuff that humans have studied and been a part of since the beginning of time. Okay, well, that's all for today. I hope this was an enjoyable video and you're able to follow it, and I'll see you next time.